Welcome back. This time we are going to talk about the economy and the upcoming elections. You may have heard that the economy is doing great, but you cannot believe it, and I don't blame you, because the trend is good. Yes, the trend is good, but you cannot see the trend. If your main concern is inflation and you are uncertain about the trend because you cannot see the trend, and you cannot see the trend because of those brusque ups and downs in inflation volatility, in the increments of inflation, and your candidate is telling you about pay leave, about her clock, about bringing more Republicans to the cabinet. You are going to feel that your candidate is trying to misdirect you, and probably she's just misguided by her poor campaign manager. But that's what you are going to see. Now, having said that, let me start about inflation. There is something called the marginal productivity of labor. What does that mean? That means that what part of the value you have produced is due to labor, and your wage, in theory, should be equal to that marginal productivity of labor, to the value you have added to the product that your employer is selling. Since the 80s, we have seen that the wages have stayed pretty much stagnant, while the marginal productivity has increased, what means that there has been a gross wage gap. But unfortunately, people have assumed that as a fact of life. That's why when you see messages about the abuse of companies that take leverage on their oligopoly position, you will see not much reaction among the voters. Then you see the effect of cheap imports from first Japan and then China. That implied an increased purchasing power, because additional purchasing power was absorbed by increases in prices in education, in healthcare, and in rent, in housing, which we took as a fact of life, as a predictable fact of life. You saw no, you saw no public reaction that translated into power, into political power. Actually, when Obama pushes Obamacare in 2008, he does so as making it more affordable, but that's all. Not in controlling the oligopoly power of that uncompetitive market that is healthcare, and much less about extending coverage. So we see that inflation uncertainty is the top issue because it's unpredictable, it's uncertainty. And we can see that especially especially for those with incomes around $50,000 or less. at least according to the New York Federal Reserve, you will see how inflation uncertainty has even increased among this last demographic group, while the inflation trend, has been going downward. This is intimately linked to two issues, which are expectations or the uncertainty about income growth. And you will see that the group that is much more affected is no wonder this group with incomes around $50,000 or less. And of course, because the way we have been fighting inflation is through interest rates, this is also intimately linked to interest rates. And those are elements that are have affected the perceptions of in the inflation trend that have created inflation uncertainty on inflation, especially among small businesses that are less informed than the big corporations, and even among the even in the bond market. And you can see that in the yield curve, for instance, that still now is not reacting as expected in theory to the Federal Reserve last rate cut. You can see that the long-term interest rate, instead of decreasing, has actually increased, affecting mortgage rates and deflating the expectations of refinancing of many people who are still struggling with expensive mortgages. This level of anxiety created by this inflation uncertainty is exacerbated by the fact that savings are gone, especially for the medium and lower income brackets. This has translated that into, even though we have reports of increasing consumption and increasing income on the average, that credit card is rising as has reached record levels, especially on the lower income brackets. And you can see an increase in delinquencies, which could be difficult to understand unless you take into account the income brackets. As if this were not enough, even though the Fed has been doing a good job to help banks, especially regional banks, to adjust to the valuation crisis in commercial real estate, we still have good levels of uncertainty, because this is not a crisis. Property crisis take time to adjust, because it means absorb huge losses, and this is not an exception. Add to that the levels of uncertainty associated to possible government shutdowns if if Congress doesn't have enough majorities on one side or the other to prevent this from happening. To that, you can add the fact that regulation in banking has failed. Regulation should be the anchor you use to get some stability in times of, especially in times of uncertainty. So to find some predictability in times of rapid change or change that is not goes beyond what theory teaches us to expect. Teaches us to expect. Yet, it has been very disappointing to see Powell to water down the regulations proposed he, by his own Federal Reserve that would have allowed to adjust capital requirements to the Basel standards. And it's not just that, the stress tests as the small panic of last year that cost us four regional banks tell us about the stress test inadequacy that was highlighted, among others, by Amit Seru and Chilaver. Where did this come from? This comes from the 2017 bank deregulation that that exempted from regulation banks with assets under $250 billion. The Frank bill that was passed after the Great Recession to regulate the excesses of the banks had set that limit in $50 billion. So practically the Trump's bill exempted from regulation all but the biggest banks. And that has been, that was a terrible decision, a terrible bipartisan decision, because some regional banks were practically going under the radar, and we only knew about their screw ups when after the fact. But this is worse because it doesn't mean that those banks were completely in the shadows. It just does mean that the Fed that couldn't apply the stress tests, but then the Trump people in the Federal Reserve relaxed the auditors, the examiners' decisions to mere recommendations. And that's why, for instance, when Silicon Valley was told that that they needed to apply some hedging, that is a tool to prevent risks, among others, interest rate risks, with the blessing of the Fed, Silicon Valley would dismiss those recommendations because they were just that, mere recommendations. Another issue that has been neglected was the designation of shadow banking as systemic risk. That means at what point a shadow banking institution could imply a systemic risk, a risk for all the system. And the more interlinked the shadow banking and the regular banking, the regulated banking are, the more relevant this issue is. And yet it has this issue or has also been neglected. So for all the merits Powell has had in his managing the interest rate, his record in regulation is pitiful. And as I said, regulation is supposed to be the anchor in times of uncertainty. Now, let's go to the problem that originated all this mayhem. It was not the additional spending passed by Biden at the start of his administration. It was the supply chain. Supply chain. The problem was that when the dislocation of the supply chain started translating itself in higher prices, because because you could find these long lines of ships that could not get to the ports and unload. You could see those high piles of containers that could not be uploaded, that could not be delivered, and those empty containers that could not be removed out of the way because of the pandemic. You saw that the Biden administration reactions were very tiny, diminutive. For instance, he extended the hours of operations of the Los Angeles port, but the rest of the supply chain kept working at regular hours, or he imposed a penalty of $100 per container, where those prices have per container and the freight rates have skyrocketed in the thousands. So it's these ridiculous measures that allowed the inflation, the original inflation, spread in the system. And what could have he done? Let me go once again to the example of FDR, Roosevelt. He was in 1933. He was fighting the exactly opposite phenomenon, depression. And he had a number of programs, for instance, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what provided the Civilian Conservation Corps of logistical support? It was the Army. What stopped Biden of using the Army to at least get drivers for the trucks and use Navy facilities to take those containers that, because of their late arrival, have become unwanted, or those empty containers, and remove them to other facilities so they would not be clogging the flow of goods, of imported goods. Well, it was nothing. Actually, in one town hall, Biden was asked why he didn't use the National Guard. Actually, he should have used the Army Corps of Engineers. But, well, yeah, why didn't he use the National Guard? And he said that that idea had been proposed and then never again. Remember that the inflation on goods, imported goods, doesn't stay imported goods. It spreads to the rest of the system, and those who with more bargaining power have can pass their prices to those who have less leverage. For instance, big corporations could pass the prices, use their pricing power to pass inflation to the consumers. Workers who were unionized could get increases that other workers could not. And only the savings that the Biden package, original package, provided these low income workers, allow them to some bargaining power, though it meant wasting those savings in practically negotiating with employers, something that was not the original intention. So then let's move to housing. Housing has been a good part, and I mean the not the part of inflation that is uh, assumed in the case of the owner of the house, in the case of CPI, because if he didn't own the house, he would be paying rent. No, no, no. I am talking about rent actually paid, mortgages actually paid. And this, even in this element, the inflation has been growing very rapidly. And it has, the lower your income is, the more housing wages in your economic decisions, because it takes more of your money. When we find that though there are several estimations, we have a housing shortage of about 4,000 units. Permitting is still, zoning is still the most important factor explaining this shortage, but also the oligopoly power of certain companies, especially after with the Great Recession and then the pandemic, smaller companies lost leverage, financial leverage to compete with the Big Ten. So here is where I would like to bring back a proposal I made in my tweet, that is an adaptation of a Brookings proposal of consolidating permitting for the grid at the federal level. You could also here consolidate permitting on housing for up to 4 million units. That is the shortage, as it has been estimated by most sources. And this tool could allow you to bid, to request bids for permitting for housing with federal help, depending on two factors: prices and time of delivery. Why time of delivery? Because there is a CNBC, a good CNBC piece of reporting that shows that the Big Ten, the way they have been making money is by dragging their feet in construction. So they have created this shortage so the prices could skyrocket and they could make more money per unit. So we could get some level at least to for these 4 million units, and that way to give the smaller companies uh, the kind of competitiveness they have before the pandemic and the Great Recession. And permitting is also the problem, is the bottleneck for for renewables. So why not applying the Brookings proposal as it was intended? Is there has been not just Brookings, the New York Times, Many others have pointed to this issue, and yet the Biden administration has done nothing or even tried. Then you could say, well, but this would mean investments. Yes, but you could use help with investments with transmission-backed securities. That means it's like the mortgage-backed securities, but backed by infrastructure projects directed to transmission and to expand the grid. And this could be sold to the Federal Reserve and then resold to the market. And especially now that the Federal Reserve is reducing its balance from mortgage-backed securities. So, and that would give this would provide long-term investment opportunities and save the grid, save transmission from debates about funding and all the brinkmanship we see in Congress. Next year we are expecting a new American Society of Civil Engineers card about our infrastructure, but despite the Biden's bills about on this end, I don't expect big improvement. But the D we got from the ASCE should be a warning that we cannot be postponing this kind of investments, and not just physical infrastructure, but also the human infrastructure, because we need a labor force that is up to the task to go hand in hand with these improvements in the grid and other fields. Then I would like to talk about, I will go into detail after the intermission, but we need to create a government and upgrade and waste commission. And why is this important? Because if you are a Democrat, you need the government to work, and the trust in government has decreased steadily since the times of Kennedy. In other words, people don't trust government. And we need to define what parts of government are really wasteful and correct, and what parts of government needs an upgrade. For instance, the IRS, because if you let MAGA to define the issue, you should not then be surprised if the IRS is defunded. You should not be surprised then if they come with ridiculous assumptions about how eliminating some programs are going to make people more competitive, because then they are going to realize that they have to get new skills and blah, blah, blah. So if you don't define the issue, an issue that is so important, then your opponents are going to do it. And having said that, let me leave you with the intermission.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and we continue with the main headlines of the hour, among other local news. From now on in San Francisco, California, it will be mandatory to be gay at least once a year. The fulfillment of this new edict will be credited with an affidavit to be billed and filed no later than tax day. Now on in Maricopa, Arizona, it will be mandatory to shoot an immigrant at least once a year. The fundamental of this new edict and the fulfillment thereof will be credited with an affidavit to be filed in the county no later than Christmas. From now on in San Francisco, California, a picture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro will be held in City Hall at the side of President George Washington. From now on in Phoenix City Hall, Arizona, a picture of Russian President Vladimir Putin will be held in City Hall at the side of President Washington. From now on in San Francisco, California, the Declaration of Independence will be reviled as an instrument of white suppression and burned in effigy. From now on in Maricopa, Arizona, schools will teach that former President Trump was among the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. From now on in San Francisco, California, it will be mandatory for teachers to teach on at least once a day before Easter that on the third day, Jesus Christ resurrected and came out of the closet. From now on in Maricopa County, it will be mandatory for teachers to say on the last school day before Easter that Jesus Christ was in favor of the flat tax, immigration crackdowns, and hated poor people. Sponsored by Jill Stein for president, we dare you to believe that with your vote, it's possible that Jill can jump from 1% to 51%, so Trump will not be elected. Jill's psychiatric diagnosis will bring her into harmony with her spirit guides. Jill's bicycle song will rank #1 in Rolling Stone. Jill will align her chakras and yours. We believe, and you can believe. An ad sponsored by Jill Stein for president and the American Psychiatric Association chip in. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.
Welcome back. In this second part, I would like to make some recommendations for the Kamala Harris campaign. That is #1. Don't avoid the issue of that is more salient in the minds of the voters. This is inflation and interest rates. So we could have disagreements about, for instance, the difference between corporate pricing power and price gouging. And on that, I am in agreement with Paul Krugman. We don't have a significant problem of price gouging, but we do have, excuse me, we do have a significant problem of corporate pricing power. So I don't want to split hairs, but notice that when Kamala came with these proposals for the economy that implied some distancing from Biden, she rose in the polls. And now that her main message is about how she loves her Glock and how she loves Dick Cheney, she has flattened in the polls. And actually, at the time when she made those proposals, she had 4 out of 7 swing states and was tied in 1. The last time I have checked Real Clear Politics, she had lost all the states to Trump. Within the margin of error, which means it's possible still to recover, but that implies decisive action. #1, tackle the salient issue, uncertainty at inflation and interest rates. Don't go trying to, like a cheap magician, trying to misdirect the voter, because the only thing you will see that will get is that they will distrust you. #2 is you have to break with Biden. So we are not talking here about that your opponent is John Kasich or Jeb Bush. It could be bad, but it would not be terrible. We are talking here that your opponent is Donald Trump. So you have to be, you cannot say that you don't want to hurt Biden's feelings because that's ridiculous considering what is at stake here. Then, unfortunately, when Biden lost Congress, he lost all possibility of fiscal policy. So, if you cannot win at the policy, try at least to win at the narrative. Attack Trump on tariffs, the Fed independence, and immigration, as the Peterson Institute has implied, but also on, for instance, adapting the Brookings proposal for the grid to housing for up to 4 million units, because Trump opposes that consolidation of permitting at the federal level. So you can at least try to win in the narrative. Now, for instance, when we come to tariffs, you have to abandon that America First counterproductive policy that was started by Trump and continued by Biden. I know it sounds good. We put tariffs, so instead of this item being produced in China, it is produced here. But that's too simplistic. Number one, because Krugman, David Lynch, and others have, and the Brookings Institute have noticed you may benefit some sectors, but all the other sectors that are dependent on those items that are imported now will have to face increased prices on the inputs they use to produce their outputs. So you are going to affect employment, you are going to affect other sectors. But it's on top of that, besides that, it's not that easy because China's reaction to Trump's increase in tariffs was to outsource production to other countries like Vietnam. So now much of the product was made in part of the product was made of Vietnam, but much of the product was made with Chinese input. So in the end, what are you going to do? Are you going to put tariffs on Vietnam too? And if they move to Mexico or Mexico too? So the Asian economy is too interconnected. Where are you going to set the red line? So that is not that easy, and you could make you could even end up with a trade war if the other countries to whom you have imposed tariffs retaliate. Not to mention the geopolitical implications, because with a Putin that is trying to become Xi Jinping's senior partner, anything that could be interpreted as hostility pushes those countries in that direction. Now, but you may say, well, but what do you do with cases like the pandemic? During the pandemic, China became a bottleneck for products we needed, so led to that to that inflation you are decrying so much, and that's correct. But you can use a better tool for that instead of tariffs is quotas, and we use quotas to regulate the number of units that came from Japan in the 1980s and 90s, and that number of quotas, that quotas about the maximum number of units that can come in, could allow us to have some competition inside inside the United States. So in case there is another interruption of supplies, we have at least some base on which we can build. Then, from the Peterson Institute assessment, we see that another factor that could be very harmful is the Fed independence. Kamala Harris should have a say in interest rates because it affects the voters. It affects their expectations about rent, and especially ownership, the American dream, about refinancing debt when credit card debt. So it has many implications, and if you don't have a say, if you don't open your mouth, you will look unaware or detached. That doesn't mean that you are going to do like Trump wants to affect, to limit the Fed's independence. You can do both. You can have an opinion because you are a president. You are the president of the United States, but at the same time, say clearly that you intend to respect the Federal Reserve independence. Then the other issue mentioned by the Peterson Institute was immigration, but after the way the Biden administration mishandled this issue, I turned it toxic. I don't expect that Kamala Harris is going to defend the positive effects it has on the on growth, as it has been acknowledged by the CBO itself. Then why did another point I wanted to mention about the government upgrade and waste commission I mentioned before is another role is the role at giving visibility to many things that go under the radar. Kamala, if she is elected, or any president, any Democrat that is elected in the future, if they are elected, because they are excellent at winning the campaigns, they cannot lose despite their best efforts, it's going to need revenue. Now, but a problem is that what is the option? Rates or loopholes? I prefer loopholes to close loopholes. The problem with that is that, as the cases of Biden minimum tax, corporate minimum tax, and the global minimum tax have demonstrated, as soon as these pieces of legislation are passed, they amended with the recommendations provided by lobbyists. This is also what happened to the Volcker rule, a 3-page simple rule that was turned into ineffective after the work of lobbyists in Congress. So what I am proposing is that part of this government upgrade and waste commission should bring visibility on any modification, any alteration of the original laws that we are passing, so the public is aware. Because if not, these laws, like the Frank law after the Great Recession, may be good, may be great, but then they die in obscurity, like the Frank law in 2017. So it should not surprise us that the trust in government is at at its lowest levels in several decades. And as I said, as it was noticed in the Peterson Institute, the fiscal challenge report, you are going to need the government. You are going to need the revenue. And it should not surprise us that the trust in government is so low. And you will have two problems: revenue, but also spending. What is the spending that is showing the most harmful path is healthcare. So you have to rein in healthcare. The Affordable Care Act was an improvement with respect to the status quo, but it has to be improved. It has to be improved so we can rein on healthcare costs. And that this implies also that you have to redo the image of the IRS, because you need to enforce if you are going to close loopholes, you need an agency that can enforce that new law. And the image of the IRS was hugely damaged by past administrations that not only defunded it, but imposed some quotas that, because the IRS could not fill with big tax sheets, try to fill it with the people who could defend themselves the least, and that's why they become specialists in finding tax sheets in between among unaware earned income credit or child tax credit or the Schedule C of small businesses that were not have not been done according to IRS guidelines, complicated IRS guidelines, and that's how the IRS got discredited among the commoners like us, and that's an image that has to be redone. If you have been grown, admit it frankly, as FDR said, but then do something. Here we have not admitted past errors, and what we have done it in ways that are so timid, that are very easily to undo in the dark shadows of Congress. Then we need a new proposal in education. With our education system is wasteful. It consists in FAFSA tax credits, tax benefits, and FAFSA loans that lead to the well-to-do to Ivy Leagues and to the rest of us, the commoners, to second-tier education institutions that give you a debt and a diploma, but nothing else, not the opportunity you were expecting. So what I am proposing here is, instead of all these benefits for education, what about a public option for higher education? So we can provide we can provide a supply of education that is going to be free for those who cannot pay for it. You can even add an stipend for those who who need that stipend in order to 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 intelligent students who cannot afford to study because they have to work, and you can this education can be provided and state of the art in a state of the art public option. And that way and you can add to that package tax incentives for companies that invest in their workers through apprenticeship. And the German model for apprenticeship is very good. We can even copy it. Actually, the way to pay then this would include student loans, but for past education, not for new, because if you don't want the public option and you still want to go to a private institution, well, go, but then pay with your own money. Because if you want to study in the University of Phoenix, why the rest of the taxpayers pay for an education that is not going to be in the best interest of us all? It's just going to be provide you a diploma, like a nobiliary title. And for this, you could include, as I said, in this package, a student loan, if not forgiveness, at least something resembling the German model. 2 or 3 years, you will pay an extra, or a number of years, you will pay an extra rate in your income tax return, and that's the way you would pay your education. Of course, the public option would allow us to completely eradicate this problem for the next generations. Then another thing, just to mention another idea that went under the radar, but is important, is to upgrade the minimum wage. But many small companies, especially after the pandemic, are not in conditions to pay minimum wage. So why not taking the position, the proposal made by Gabriel and Zuckman, and with one modification? You increase the minimum wage, let's say, to $15. But if you are working for a company that is considered, depending on the amount of sales, as small businesses, the small company is going to be exempted, and you are going to be compensated through your earned income credit. It's a reasonable, doable way, but it has not been even proposed because, as I mentioned in my first video, there are lots of good ideas that go under the radar, and then we are condemned to the ridiculous and counterproductive ideas that then are the source of our loop of disappointment. Then the Supreme Court. And one terrible problem is that Biden has been obsessed with not doing anything that could irritate the Supreme Court. That's exactly the opposite of what's happening with Roosevelt. Roosevelt clashed in 1937 with the Supreme Court. And by then, they also were for, like now, there were for the ultra-conservative members of the Supreme Court, the so-called four horsemen, And they even passed a terrible decision about working conditions that is was known as Tipaldo in 1936. So the Supreme Court had a lot of discredit like it has today. And FDR clashed. He made some tactical mistakes, yes, but at least he got something. The Supreme Court never again clashed with the New Deal, and he got to appoint the next four members. It's something that I have called the Tipaldo strategy that the Biden administration doesn't have. And don't come to me with the lie that well, Biden in those times Republicans were not a significant opposition. No, they were not. But his main opposition came from inside the Democratic Party, from Southern Democrats. So stop making excuses. Then another thing I wanted to mention before finishing was Kamala Harris' work and the Democrats' problem in general with the working class. They have become people from very different extractions, from like Thomas Piketty at the left and Farid Zakari at the center. The Democratic Party has become the party of the well-educated. You have to show that you are willing to fight for the working class, for union rights. You are willing to spread light about the abuse of corporations and show that you are willing to do something about that. So that's why when people see their perceptions of Trump record, they are practically they are deceived, yes, but when they compare their living standards, the levels of inflation, and their interest rates, they find that the Trump administration was not that bad. And I will tell you what this was bad, but that's why they see, because they don't see a different narrative. On the issues where the Biden administration is clearly better is in growth and jobs, but that means that given the levels of income inequality, even though it has been slightly reduced, don't are not consolation enough for the working class. And now you could see that in the also when you consider the real average our hourly earnings and the real median weekly earnings. So in other words, the purchasing power of their salaries or wages could buy. And having said that, let me tell you why they are not the same. They are not the same because when you have you overheat the economy, as Trump did before the the pandemic, and allow all corporations to transgrade all kinds of regulations, it's very easy to get better numbers than an administration that is diligent on those two ends. That's what happened before the Great Recession. We let many big banks and investment banks do whatever they wanted in the housing market, and we know what happened in 2008. That's just one example of what happens. An economy where it's a free for all is going to give you a mirage in the short term that everything is going good until things explode, like many bubbles explode at the end. And the less powerful are the people who suffer the most. Again, the Great Recession. So that's a lot, has a lot to do with the problem with Democrats to propose a new economic model and the role of government in it. If you're a Democrat, you need that government works and that government is trusted. If not, you are just doing what Obama did. So you are opposing the good tax cuts to the bad tax cuts. The good tax cuts are for the middle class, and the bad tax cuts are the Republican tax cuts for the rich. And what they need, what the government, what the country needs is investment for the future. So we can be better off in the days ahead. And having said that, I must say that I am not very optimistic about Kamala Harris' options at this point, but that if she has some kind of epiphany and invokes, it portrays herself as a continuation, not of Biden as she did in the View, but of FDR, there might still be hope. And having said that, thank you.